Wait, they did what? They drove the train away, but didn't the train just get there? And it was carrying all the ammunition too, huh? Wow. Okay, well, what now? Guards on each train. Yeah, the price of freedom, huh? Yeah. All right, see ya. July 16th, 1950. Although, other than Koreans, the only ground troops fighting this war so far are Americans, the United Nations expects there to be more from its member states. And this week, they officially choose the man to run UN command, Douglas MacArthur. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week saw the first action between American ground forces, Task Force Smith, and KPA, North Korean, forces. Lacking both equipment and training, the Americans were badly routed. After that, other units of U.S. 24th Division faced the KPA and were also soundly beaten. The ROK, the South Koreans, are reorganizing though, and their army had nearly 70,000 men. And though the KPA advanced all week across the country, in many places they began taking heavy casualties. Of course, they are still advancing all over this week. Now, the 21st Regiment from U.S. 24th Division fully arrived at Taejon last week, the 7th. Divisional Commander William Dean sent them north under their commander, Colonel Richard Stevens, to delay the enemy at Chochiwon, support the 34th Regiment, and keep the supply route to 34th open. However, at Chochiwon, all was confusion. There were no train schedules or train manifests. Supplies for the 24th Division and for the ROK 1st Corps eastward at Cheongju arrived all mixed together. The South Korean locomotive engineers were hard to manage. At the least alarm, they were apt to bolt south, with trains still unloaded, carrying away the supplies and ammunition they had just brought up to the front. American officers had to place guards aboard each locomotive. Dean's orders went out late on the 8th for 24th Division to withdraw to positions along the south bank of the Kum River, 15 kilometers south of Chochiwon, while delaying the enemy. The orders say, hold the Kum River line at all costs. Maximum delay will be effected. So now, 21st Infantry is to hold back the enemy in front of Chochiwon and 34th along the road to the river. 21st has a battery of howitzers and a company of M24 light tanks with them. And engineers ready all the Kum River bridges for demolition. The plan is delay, and then make a stand at the river, deciding the fate of Taejon perhaps there. If Major General William F. Dean, the commander of the 24th Division, imagined that the fiascos at Pyeongtaek and Chonan were the low water mark of his campaign, he was wrong. The town of Taejon contained his divisional headquarters and supply dumps, well stocked with fuel, rations, and ammunition. He intended to make a stand in front of this important communications center. On the 9th, at the end of last week, the enemy engaged the forward American positions at Chonwi. American airstrikes were called in, directed by tactical air control parties, and 5 of 11 arriving enemy tanks were on fire by late afternoon. And by the evening, roughly half of the 200 or so vehicles on the road down from Pyeongtaek were burning. On the 10th, as this week begins though, the land is covered by morning fog, which the KPA uses to infiltrate both men and tanks around and behind the American positions. When the fog clears, they advance, and while airstrikes delay their advance, once they're finished, the advance continues, overrunning the American left, where most of the men die in their foxholes. Stevens orders retreat at 12:05. Though much of his right flank has already pulled back by then, he's lost about 20% of his total force. He orders a battalion-level counterattack to try to rescue some of the men on the left, and they do manage to find 10 of them. They cannot retake the positions. But they discover the first known KPA atrocity against captured American soldiers. 6 of them from a heavy mortar company are found with their hands tied behind their backs and shot through the head. I have a lot to say about atrocities committed by both sides already from the first week of the war. And I put that little side note in to introduce the topic. In a couple of weeks, I'll address it more thoroughly. There has just been too much action to get into it yet. Also, people have asked if we'll have a War Against Humanity type series for the Korean War. I think so, though it likely won't come out as often as the one on the World War II in Real Time channel does. Anyhow, the pattern was repeated again and again. An uncertain and unhappy American infantry unit would be hustled into a defensive position, its officers unwilling or unable to conceal their own confusion and dismay. The flood of refugees slowed to a trickle, then halted altogether. There was a tense silence. Men peered up the empty road until they heard the tortured squeal and clatter of advancing armor. The North Korean tanks crawled forward until they met American fire. Then they halted to allow infantry to swarm past them, infiltrating the American positions and working around their flanks. The Americans then withdrew, often in undignified haste, abandoning vehicles and equipment as they escaped as best they might, amid the swelling columns of civilian refugees. The afternoon of the 10th does, however, see some real successes by United Nations air power. A few F-80 jets spot a KPA convoy stop bumper to bumper to the north of a destroyed bridge north of Pyeongtaek, so the 5th Air Force rushes in every plane it can in a massive airstrike, reportedly destroying 38 tanks, 7 half-tracks, 117 trucks, and of course killing loads of enemy soldiers. Now, the air support carried out these July weeks is by a mixed force of U.S. Navy, Marine, Air Force, and Australian fighters and U.S. fighter bombers. Back on July 3rd, the Far East Air Forces established a base on Kyushu for fighters over Korea. It moved to Taejon already the 5th, and then to Daegu now on the 14th. When heavy communications equipment arrives next week, they'll have a complete tactical air control center there. At the moment, there are 6 air-controlled parties in action with 24th Division. These are the forward ground elements that call in strikes. They also use T-6 training planes to call in strikes on or behind enemy lines. The controllers in these planes stay over the targets and use the call sign Mosquito to bring in fighters. The planes are even by now known themselves as Mosquitoes, and they carry an Air Force pilot and a ground force observer, usually. So these guys work with the control parties and the forward infantry. It's already a pretty good system. I mentioned F-80s spotting the convoy this day, but at this point, most of the Air Force's close support is done by F-51 Mustangs, which have a greater range and can use these short and rough fields in Korea. Okay, Chochiwon. On the 11th, 3rd Battalion from 21st Regiment, a few kilometers to the north of Chochiwon, is hit with a devastating KPA attack that destroys their communications and ammunition supply point. The enemy has also set up roadblocks behind the battalion to prevent resupply or evacuation of the wounded. The 3rd Battalion is completely overrun, losing nearly 60% of its men. Of those who escaped, 90% had neither weapons, ammunition, or canteens. And in many instances, the men had neither helmets or shoes. By the end of the week, just 322 out of 667 men have returned to the battalion. The 1st Battalion is next to try to, again, delay the enemy. They're hit the 12th and hit pretty hard, but they withdraw one company at a time and keep the enemy at bay as they do. By the end of that day, what's left of 3rd and 1st Battalions holds the line on the south bank of the Kum River. The actions I've talked about so far today have not sounded very impressive for the Americans, but it is the best they've done so far in this war, because 2 understrength battalions have held up 2 of the best KPA divisions, 3rd and 4th, for 3 days. They have, though, paid a high price in casualties and equipment. But let's look at the Kum River line for just a minute. That river flows around Taejon in a semicircle, protecting it sort of like a long-distance moat. And just by geography and all, Taejon is a major communications hub and a major military target to take or to protect. On all bridges on the approaches to the city, engineers have rigged demolition charges. And on the 13th, 24th Division Intel says they have 2 KPA divisions and maybe 70% strength closing in on them, backed by maybe 50 tanks. Dean has the 34th Regiment defending on the left and the 19th on the right, with the 21st now in reserve. They kind of have to be in reserve now, since in the last week, they've lost 1,433 men missing in action and only have around 1,100 men total left. 34th and 19th have 2,020 and 2,276, and the divisional artillery 2,007. The divisions facing them are also by now pretty under strength, but still have 5,000 to 6,000 men each, backed by armor and artillery. They move mainly at night by now, and mainly on small roads, thanks to the effective UN air attacks day after day. The 13th, the KPA shells Gongju from across the river. The Americans have blown the bridge there. The morning of the 14th, 4th Division troops are observed crossing the river on barges, but Yak fighters chase away the UN observation planes, and the crossing continues now unobserved. And then the 34th Infantry Defense collapses and withdraws. 5 kilometers south of the river, the 63rd Field Artillery Battalion is even overrun that day. Dean hasn't expected to hold Gongju, but he has hoped to prevent a bridgehead from being quickly formed and exploited for a drive on Taejon. Make no mistake, though, the attacks by the North Koreans this day have breached the Kum River line on a wide front, and with elements of 34th Infantry having to withdraw, 19th's left is getting more and more exposed. Crossings are attempted against 19th Sector, the 14th and 15th, but they fail with heavy casualties, though the KPA bring up a bunch of tanks, so they have some heavy firepower going from their side of the river. 19th Regiment, though, also have to send force west to fight off the crossings where 34th has pulled back. This morning, the 16th, before the sun rises, coordinated large-scale crossing attempts really get going. And by the time the sun is up, it looks like the enemy is crossing everywhere. And the KPA infiltrate around the 19th to set up a solid roadblock over 1 kilometer long in their rear in a narrow pass by midday. 19th is in real trouble. And over the following hours, as they were unable to breach the roadblock, they are just decimated, units taking massive casualties trapped as they are. Around 6 p.m., an American tank and 20 or so other vehicles managed to smash through the roadblock and head south, but it is closed for good after that, though individuals and small groups managed to slip away from the area. 19th Regiment has done what it can to delay the enemy largely by itself, but what can you do without enough reserves to deal with flanking movements and scattered penetrations? Tomorrow morning, less than half of the regiment's men positioned today along the river will report for duty, and losses as a whole are 19% of what was left of the regiment for the day's battle. KPA 3rd and 4th Divisions now set their sights on Taejon. The KPA 2nd Division was heading over late last week to join 3rd and 4th in attacking towards Taejon, but they get badly battered by the ROK Capital Division for 3 days before the South Koreans withdraw to avoid being flanked. So 2nd needs to recover before it's ready for further action. The North Koreans around there were already below Wonju at the end of last week. Now, east of the Seoul-Daegu axis, the defenses are currently run by the ROK. And from Wonju, there were only really 2 major routes southward. That through Cheongju, which runs almost due south, and that southeast towards Yeongju. The ROK 6th Division is trying to defend the former, and 8th Division the latter from further penetration. Their strategy revolves around holding the Mongyong and Danyang passes, which are pretty good for defense. That's great, but the North Koreans have 5 divisions and a tank regiment trying to take the passes. The fighting is bloody, it's brutal, but the defenses have held, though by now the KPA is having some success. Numbers slowly tell. The East Coast is a bit different. See, the Taebaek Mountains don't have many lateral communication lines, so the basic Korean geography makes this more of an isolated area of operations. It's the KPA 5th Division that's been heading south from the 38th parallel, and they've made good ground to Uljin, also landing troops there amphibiously. It seems that their training in Pyongyang was specifically to take charge of the civil authority here too. So it's going great for them, yeah? But there is this. One of the enemy's major tactical mistakes of the Korean War was the failure to press rapidly south on the East Coastal Road after crossing the parallel. By sending strong reconnaissance parties out into the wild and rugged mountains inland from the coast to make sure the rear would not be threatened, the North Korean 5th Division dissipated some of its strength and lost valuable time. There seems little doubt that had it pressed south with all possible speed, and effort, the division could have been in Pohang-dong within 2 weeks after the war began, and thus have turned, on this flank, the entire ROK and American line across the peninsula. Once in Pohang-dong, it would have been in a position to advance directly on Pusan. Well, that is a what if, but it does look likely on the surface. But by this week, the Americans and the ROK are trying to fix that situation. They are helped by monsoon rains that slow the KPA 5th Division, but they do bring serious naval and aerial bombardment against the division, naval gunfire hitting any identified supply points or troop concentrations on the coastal road, and air power strafing them daily. They've also sent a bunch of force, Koreans and Americans, to Pohang-dong and Yeongdeok, like 30 kilometers to its north. By the 13th, the North Koreans have reached points some 25 kilometers to the north of Yeongdeok. That same day, Walton Walker establishes 8th Army headquarters in Korea, with operational control for all UN ground forces in the field, whenever nations other than the US might send them in. Right now, all he has, outside of the ROK, are the occupation forces from Japan, the combat deficiencies of which I've spoken before. The 25th Division and the 1st Cavalry Division, operating as infantry, are being mobilized and sent over, but it's still Dean's 24th that has to hold the line for now. 25th actually lands this week between the 10th and 15th, and 1st Cavalry will arrive in the next few days. The British Chiefs of Staff have this to say about American deployments. It might be suggested by the Americans that in the event of their participation being insufficient to restore the situation in Korea, an atom bomb should be dropped in North Korea. If the proposal should be made, ministers would wish to know the views of the Chiefs of Staff. There was general agreement from the military point of view that the dropping of an atomic bomb in North Korea would be unsound. The effects of such action would be worldwide and might well be damaging. Moreover, it would probably provoke a global war. That is quoted in Max Hastings' The Korean War, and his comment on that is, "These remarks must rank among the more notable exercises of military understatement in history." But to preempt the possibility that the Americans will ask Britain to send in ground troops, those chiefs are already registering their opposition to it. And air power, too. The air power thing might seem a little odd, considering the RAF still has 120 squadrons of planes 5 years after World War II. But they would, in fact, have trouble finding even a single full infantry brigade to send in. They have 2 of them at home, an infantry and an armored division and attached units in Germany, 1 infantry brigade in Austria, a couple infantry battalions in Trieste, 1 understrength infantry division looking after their interests in the Middle East, backed by 5 artillery or armored regiments, a division and 2 brigades in Malaya, 1 division and support in Hong Kong, and that's it. They have not spent much at all on the military since World War II, and a lot of what I just mentioned is also under strength. Back on the 5th, the chiefs met and concluded that this Korea situation is a Moscow proxy invasion, but they really fear that it is a diversion away from a more deadly thrust closer to British interests that would soon happen elsewhere, so they don't want to send in troops here and get them stuck. This, however, is not the position of the British government. The first debate on Korea in the House of Commons was also on the 5th. Prime Minister Clement Attlee said, "I think no one can have any doubt whatever that here is a case of naked aggression. No one can doubt that it is vitally important that aggression should be halted at the outset." He was congratulated by Winston Churchill, speaking for the opposition, who said the Conservative Party will fully support the government to fight this aggression however they can. A few side notes here. Attlee's Labour Party won only a narrow victory a few months ago in February, unlike their landslide victory in 1945. And their main calls are for austerity and sacrifice. Britain still reels from World War II. Post-war life for most of the British people was still grey, cold, and bleak. It offers most of the discomforts of war without any compensating purpose in sacrifice. That's British leadership, but there is an official leadership appointment elsewhere this week. On the 10th, Douglas MacArthur is formally appointed Commander-in-Chief of United Nations Command. UN Secretary-General Trygve Lie has proposed that the Korean War be directed by a Committee on Coordination for the Assistance of Korea. But the U.S. rejects this. So the British and the French are not that opposed to it. The U.S. has, though, so far, and for at least the near future, overwhelmingly borne the burden of the war and its costs against the KPA, outside of the ROK, of course. So when Washington insists on military control, it gets it. MacArthur has been in charge of the American occupation of Japan since 1945, and has been trying to get force from Japan to Korea the past weeks. He'll get a bio special soon enough in this series, since we'll likely see a lot of him. And I talked about his World War II service quite a lot in my World War II series. Anyhow, he has actually done a lot in Japan the past few years in terms of getting the country ready to one day stand on his own again. MacArthur's technique for restoring Japan to democratic rule was that of a remote proconsul. He maintained a distance between himself and the Emperor Hirohito, on whose immunity from prosecution as a war criminal he insisted, choosing to retain the monarchy in a more constitutional form, and using Hirohito as a revered figurehead, shorn of power, but still a potent symbol of Japanese tradition and nationhood. MacArthur thus captured the hearts and minds of the Japanese people, who proved remarkably acquiescent as he steered them towards democracy and prosperity on lines which he firmly set out. I imagine we'll see over the next few years whether that works out or not. But right now, this week of the war is at its end, with the North Korean forces again defeating the Americans at several points, but the American forces getting better at doing the delaying which they're trying to do. South Koreans in the center beginning to feel the pressure of the enemy, and in the East Coast, it looks like they and the Americans are soon in for a fight. And MacArthur officially in command. He did have overall responsibility for South Korea from 1945 to 1948 as Supreme Allied Commander, though he had John Hodge and 24th Corps set up the military occupation of South Korea. That's a pretty controversial topic, and it'll get its own special soon, too, to try and do it justice. You know, already in 1943, at the Cairo Conference, Winston Churchill, Chiang Kai-shek, and Franklin Roosevelt declared that Korea would become independent after the war. Korea had formerly been a Japanese colony all the way since 1910. The Americans had not planned until pretty much the end of the World War to be involved in an occupation of Korea. Thoughts had been floating about for a committee of China, the US, and the USSR to sort of run things for a while, which of course the British and the French were not that keen on. The night of August 10th, 1945, the U.S. committee dealing with suddenly trying to maybe deny the Soviets, who just invaded Manchuria, a large chunk of Korea, settled on the 38th parallel as a proposed line for the Red Army to stop advancing down the peninsula, which it did. Considering that south of this line was the capital of Korea, the best agricultural land, a lot of industry, and a lot more than half the population, it was a surprise to many that the advancing Red Army said, cool, and stopped there when they could have pretty easily overrun the whole peninsula long before any other Allied soldiers could have arrived to challenge, though it was unlikely anyone would have challenged at that time. Korea did not mean much of anything to anyone at that point. It sure does now. And you get to follow the Korean War right here week by week by week. And you get to do this thanks to the Time Ghost Army, because that is what finances all of our productions. Mike Copier is the Time Ghost Army member of the week here, and these are the newest Army officers. You can join the Army. These are the newest Army officers. I should actually point. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. If you want to see some recent history, you should check out this mini-series we did on the Indonesian War of Independence, year by year, 1945 to 1949. It is awesome. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.